Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar called Stop Saying Cannot Read, Rethinking How We Identify Struggling Readers in Malaysian Primary Classrooms. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Neil Obrien, Anak Joseph. I am an English lecturer at the Language Department at IPG Campus Tun Abdul Razak. Most of my work for the past 13 to 14 years have been around reading and literacy in Malaysian primary classroom, especially in sekolah kebangsaan. So tonight, I would like to speak to you, fellow educators, not to blame, just a disclaimer, but to sharpen the way that we talk about pupils who struggle to read. When we sit in the staff rooms or in our offices, we tend to talk with one another. And when we talk with one another, we tend to discuss our pupils' achievement. However, the term that we use when we're discussing the pupils is always revolving around this child cannot read. Now, in reality, this blanket label hides several very different reading profiles, which we're going to uncover and discover today. In our multilingual Malaysian classrooms, especially in SK, weak reading in English does not automatically mean that the child cannot read at all. The danger in what we have been doing, labeling the pupil as cannot read, is we misidentify the problem, and when we do so, we tend to misdirect the support that we need to provide our pupils. So just to clarify what we're discussing today, I am only going to touch on sekolah kebangsaan context because that's where I have the most experience in. I will also be primarily talk about lower primary, year 1 until year 3. And we are talking about, well, I am an English lecturer, so we're going to specifically talk about English reading. Particularly, this is very crucial, where BM reading, their reading or the ability to read in Bahasa Melayu is acceptable. I would also like to make it clear that SJKC and SJKT context are out of scope tonight. The main reason is that they deserve their own conversation because the orthographies and the language ecologies are totally different. Therefore, I would not dive into that, and perhaps if we want to have another discussion for SJKC and SJKT in the future, we might do so. So it depends on the comments and feedback that you have for this particular video. So in this particular slide, we can see that at the epicenter of it is the label itself, cannot read. Now, and around it, we have 4 questions that we rarely ever stop to ask, or maybe we did ask about it. Perhaps we should have asked more. And hopefully by the end of this particular webinar today, we will be starting to ask these questions more. So let's look at the first question, cannot decode at all. So what does it mean to decode? In reading, we have multiple levels of reading. The first one is to recognize the letter. Second is the phonemes. And the third is the relationship between the graphemes and the phonemes, or what we call as grapheme-phonemes correspondence. So, when we say the pupils cannot read, are we saying that the pupils cannot identify the letters, or they cannot actually identify the phonemes? Which one is it? The second part of the equation here is the pupils can decode. However, they are doing so in a slowly manner. They have not created or grown any sort of automaticity in their reading. For example, they are still struggling with the word cat. They know it. Eventually, they will pronounce the word cat. However, the time that is needed for them to reach or to pronounce it, the complete word is taking too long. Are those the type of pupils that we are labeling as cannot read? The third equation is they can read in Bahasa Melayu, but not in English. So what is the problem here? So when, for example, even the simplest words such as cat in English, they might be pronouncing it as cat in Bahasa Melayu because they are used to it. So that signifies another problem. However, we tend to use the same level when we're describing them. Tak dapat baca, cannot read. Last but not least, can recognize some English words but not the common high frequency words. So they can identify the words like cat. However, when they reach the word the, for example, the THE, they need a lot more time to decode it. They need a lot more time to figure out how to pronounce those words. Therefore, it makes them lose the fluency as well as the accuracy in their reading. Now, I know that before you start commenting, that there are plenty more of issues in reading, and I agree. But that does not mean that we have to label each and every one of them as cannot read. We need to be more specific, because when we lose that specificity in our description of our pupils, there's a high chance that we can't actually afford the opportunities or supports that they really need. The key idea of this particular slide is simple. The label sounds simple, cannot read, but the pupils behind it are not the same. So when the pupils are not the same, our responses should not be the same either. Moving on to the next slide. This is, I believe, is something quite familiar among all English teachers. This is what we call a simple view of reading. In fact, for those who love math, this is something that we cherish because it has some formulaic sentence in there. Reading comprehension equals to word recognition times language comprehension. So what does it mean for those who may have never encountered this particular formula before? So it means that for the word recognition, which is the main idea of our webinar today, it's getting words off the page accurately and efficiently. For example, they know what it means by cat. They know what it means by hat. They know what it means by bat. And when they do so, they recognize it, they automatically understand it. Now, what about language comprehension then? Language comprehension is basically means that once the words are in their head, can they understand not just the word, but the sentences and the overall ideas? So just to repeat myself again, word recognition is, can the child get the words out of their reading material accurately and efficiently? For language comprehension, it is about once the words are in their head, because usually before we read the words pop up in our head first. So once the words are in their head, can they actually understand not just the word, but the whole entire idea of the sentence? And with these two being combined together, and mind you, this is not a plus, it's a multiplication. So this is not as simple as 1 plus 1 is 2. If either side of this particular equation, reading comprehension, which is the skill that we all aim for our pupils, if either side is weak, then the overall skill of reading comprehension will be weak. So a child can be strong in language but weak in word recognition, or the vice versa. So, moving on from this, we are going to focus more on the word recognition side because that's where our not everyone, but most of our cannot read comment are pointing towards too. Now, this particular slide is quite influential in the teaching of reading. It is by Scarborough in 2001, and this is what we call a Scarborough reading rope. So it means that the simple view of reading just now, if that's an equation, then this particular rope is actually a picture. And we all know picture paints 1,000 words. On one side of the rope, we have language comprehension strands. It covers background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure, reasoning, and literacy knowledge. On the other side, which is at the bottom, we have the word recognition strands. So in this particular strand, we have phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition of familiar words. Now, I understand there might be some of us that are quite anxious when you see all these terminologies, and truth to be told, if we were to cover each and every single one of them, we might have to continue this video for maybe 2 to 3 hours. So I'm not going to waste everyone's time. Let us get back into the business. So, what it means, why do I show you this particular picture? It's because in the early primary years, the early stage where the readers are turning from pre-illiterate to emergent readers, these strands, both strands, are thin and separated. And we have to teach them explicitly, meaning to say that for teachers, particularly in preschool, year 1, year 2, and year 3, we have to, number one, we have to demonstrate all of these particular skills: phonological awareness, decoding, sight recognition of familiar words, high frequency words, and we have to activate the background knowledge, we have to top up the vocabulary bank, we have to emphasize, we have to showcase the language structures, verbal reasoning, as well as literacy knowledge. As teachers, we have to demonstrate all of this throughout the first 5 years of their education. Over time, they become increasingly coordinated and automatic. They gain their automaticity. And once they have turned into a very solid, thick rope, then we have reached our destination. We have skilled readers. Now, once again, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind you that this is what we want. And the main reasons why I show the simple view of reading as well as Scarborough reading rope here is to remind myself as well as the educators out there that these are the things that we need to know, that we need to demonstrate, that we need to find out. Whenever certain pupils struggle in their reading, we have to go back and check which part of the strands that our pupils are struggling. So if we were to label them as cannot read, then it is going to make our life that much more difficult to offer the accurate support that our pupils need. So I'm going to keep on coming back to this word recognition site. I want to show how different pupils can have different weaknesses in these strands, even though they all get called as, yes, you guess it, cannot read. Now, moving on to the next slide. Now we are dealing with the labels. What we often say, this child cannot read. This one is weak in English. And trust me, ladies and gentlemen, the labels get worse as we go down this list. Number 3, this one is lazy. And number 4, this one can read but does not understand. Ooh, I think we all have heard that. One time too many. What I hope actually for us to start after we finish this particular video is for us to help changing the idea of the statement into some questions. The first questions, as you can see on the screen there, which part of reading is weak? Which part of it? Is it the high frequency words, or they are still weak in the segmenting and blending, or perhaps the words, the reading material itself is too difficult for them to understand, that forcing them to read it over and over again does not improve comprehension, fluency, nor accuracy. Then the second question that we should probably ask is the problem mainly in word recognition? What it means is that, do they actually cannot recognize the words? Or they do recognize the words, but they find it difficult to segment it or to blend it. And when they struggle to segment and blend, they find it difficult to match whatever image of that particular words in their head to any of their pre-existing knowledge. As you all know by now, if you have been with me over the past 10 to 20 minutes or so, congratulations, you've made it this far. But if you have followed this particular video or webinar right until now, you should already realize that reading is not easy. Okay, there's a lot of science behind it, and it's not straightforward as we think. Therefore, labeling them inaccurately is going to make that problem a bit more difficult to solve. Now, the third question is the problem similar across Bahasa Melayu and English? So, in schools, teachers usually communicate with one another, and you will actually compare and contrast. So, if the pupils have problems in English but not BM, Bahasa Melayu, then there might be something going on there. Perhaps it has got to do with their phonemic awareness, phonological awareness. So, the teachers would have to reintroduce it by one of the most common way for teachers to do now is through Jolly Phonics. Okay? And the last question is, what exactly is breaking down? When we go back to the strands, now there are multiple components of it. So we have to identify which part, which component in those strands that our pupils are struggling in, that cause them to not being able to accurately, fluently read what they need to read and understand what they need to understand. So, if we could switch the models from the left, what we often say, to the right, to asking the questions, we could be moving from judging our pupils to actually diagnosing, offering diagnostic that will eventually narrow down the supports that we need to give. I don't particularly use the word intervention, but for the lack of better term right now, intervention seems to be a suitable term to be used, because without an accurate and pinpointed intervention, most pupils would unfortunately drift away and will never gain the status of skilled readers through their schooling years, unfortunately. So we have several profiles that we're going to share here today. There are going to be 3 profiles, and I want to show you 3 very common profiles of pupils in SK who all risk of being labeled as cannot read. But actually, they have different needs from one another. So we'll have a look at each profile, a simple case vignette, and then what that means on how we actually label, or how we're going to diagnose our pupils, how we talk about them. So the first one here is we have profile 1, emergent bilingual readers in English. So when someone is an emergent readers, it means that, emergent bilingual readers, it means that both their capabilities in reading for Bahasa Melayu as well as English, they are starting out. Therefore, we can actually expect that there are certain pauses, there are certain inaccuracies that may happen when they are reading. They might be facing some issues recognizing high frequency words, particularly if they have not been exposed to those words in meaningful ways. So this particular pupil have acceptable BM reading but slightly delayed in English. Difficulty reflects weaker English decoding, meaning to say that they are facing, like what I said just now, they are facing some phonological awareness issues whereby they might have problems identifying the phonics. They are struggling with the vocabulary, high frequency words, and they have limited exposure towards English. Now, a weak reading in English does not actually mean that they are globally non-reading. It does not mean that they cannot read at all. They shouldn't be labeled as they cannot read. So, these particular pupils, they read BM text with reasonable fluency, recognizes some English letters, guesses at words in connected text, which means here at this particular level, the pupils, they have some knowledge of letters. They should have more knowledge because they could read in Bahasa Melayu, so it means that they have experienced some disconnection in recognizing the phonics. Okay, and they have the good thing about this particular pupil is that they made attempts to guess the words in connected text. So it also emphasizes that the importance of meaningful words in meaningful ways for them when we are trying to increase their exposure towards English. And number 3 is that this particular pupil could understand oral classroom English but struggles to decode it independently. They could listen to it, they could understand the instructions, but when they are being given certain tasks, certain reading materials, they struggle to do it independently. Hence, the term emergent in English reading. So, it is quite crucial for us to identify that, to stop ourselves from labeling this particular pupil as cannot read in English. Because he or she, they, indeed could read, but not to an acceptable level, especially in year one, if I'm not mistaken. So there are rooms for improvement, particularly in terms of introducing them with phonics, interventions to be carried out, more on the segmenting and blending abilities, and providing them with a lot more of meaningful high frequency vocabularies. The keyword there is meaningful. You don't just give them a list and hope that they can memorize them, because truth be told, even though teachers are known to be miracle workers, we don't do that kind of miracle yet. Maybe one day. And case number two, profile number two, we have emergent bilingual. This is for year two pupil. The pupil can actually decode, but reading is inaccurate, slow, or choppy. So there is no fluency in there. Lack of automaticity severely limits the comprehension, because all of the cognitive ability is spent on segmenting and blending the words, that when they have reached the end of the sentence, all that they have done is they have read everything in great pain, I must say. But because of all the power, the cognitive power, are being channeled towards the segmenting and blending, recognizing phonemes, and because of no automaticity, there is little room for comprehension. And this is quite common, you see. This is where we often treat or label our pupil as they can read, but they don't understand. It's because of this. They still lack the automaticity. They spend the entire cognitive ability to recognize, to break down the words, to memorize or to recall the phonemes. How do they match up? How do I chunk these words out in order to formulate it into words? And when they say it out loud, it may not sound accurate in their head. And once they listen to it, so they would have to go back and repeat it again. So these tasks are quite difficult for the pupils. And when this usually happens when they are not given enough opportunity to read. When they are given the opportunity to read, however, the reading material may be a bit too difficult for their level, or they have not been taught, or they have not gone through the progression. Meaning, you said the progression from the word to phrases to simple sentences, and then to more simple sentences combined together, forming a text. They have not gone through the natural progression. Instead, they are just given a text. And usually for emergent readers, when they are given a bunch of sentences, words combined together and forming a paragraph, they feel anxious. And when they feel anxious, everything's gone out of the window. That's where the choppiness, that's where the automaticity gone. Okay, so these particular people, they could sound out most words in short passage. So they can sound out. It takes time, but they eventually reach the end. They have not reached the destination, but they have reached the end of the text or passage. They read the word by word very slowly with frequent self-correction. So this is a common cause, or a common behavior by pupils that do not have enough exposure when it comes to reading. finishes the text, like what I said, but cannot explain the meaning. Why? Because the mental capacity is spent entirely in sounding those words out. Decoding exists, but automaticity is extremely weak. They need more practice, and eventually they will get there if they are given enough practice. So sounding out is not the same as skilled reading. That's where we get our pupils, when we see our pupils, they keep on sounding out certain words, but when you ask them, they struggle to convey the meaning to you. So this is what happened. They can decode, meaning to say that they are slightly better than the first pupil just now, but now we are focusing on enhancing them. And in enhancing them, it requires a few more steps before they could actually increase their automaticity as well as their reading comprehension. Now we move on to the third pupil. This particular pupil, they could decode regular words but repeatedly stumble. Sorry, I received a phone call. Okay. They could decode regular words, but they repeatedly stumbles on common sight words such as the, was, what, and there. It indicates weak orthographic mapping, not for the lack of effort, but it shows that they are not provided enough material yet. So it slows down their reading because they are struggling with common sighted words. It slows down their reading, it reduces their confidence because they realize that I should know this word, but I don't, and they are struggling with it internally, and it interrupts their comprehension. These particular people, they could decode simple CVC words, cat, sit, mat, sat, repeatedly hesitates on common words such as the, was, and what. And they, even though you have actually corrected them or reminded them that, oh, this is the, they can appear to forget the same words repeatedly. They rely on pictures instead. But there's no picture for the. There's no picture for what? There's no picture for they. And there's no picture for was. Isn't it? So it shows that the pupils are struggling with those words, perhaps because of the lack of meaningful reading materials. So you see, some of us are pushing the phonics lesson into our pupils with high tenacity. That means that we have equipped our pupils with the ability to recognize the phonemes, to break down any difficult words by segmenting them. We've done all that. However, there might be something that we are missing. We don't give them enough meaningful task, meaningful reading task, real book, real language use of whatever that they are reading. So they might be good in decoding difficult words. They could probably recognize onomatopoeia, for example, because of the sound of it. They could break it down, onomatopoeia. However, they are struggling with the word the. Why? Because it's quite difficult to break down the word the. And when they are not given enough opportunity to read sentences, to read words in meaningful books, in meaningful texts, and they don't see how the language is being used, that's where they have weak orthographies. They are struggling to formulate how the look of the word should sound like in their brain because lack of practice. Now, are we still going to say that this particular pupil as cannot read? Excuse me. We shouldn't. Okay? So all three pupils have different needs. They show almost similar kind of attributes. Some struggling with automaticity, some is struggling with comprehension, some struggles with common cited words. But all of them are, in fact, quite difficult. So if we were to put all the profiles side by side, we can actually see how much the label cannot read actually hides, and it hinders us from moving forward. So on the left over here, we can see that what teachers may say. I'm not saying that that's what you are saying, but this is not impossible. Cannot read English. Can read but very weak. Always forgets simple words. So these are the three profiles, right? So the first line is for the first profile, the second line is for the second, and so on. So what may actually be happening is that emergent bilingual in English. So they cannot read English, but once that level sticks with the pupil, teachers may be hesitant in providing higher order materials or more difficult, more advanced material to the pupils. And that actually causes the pupil to remain stagnant at as emergent bilingual in English. And that is not going to help them much. What educators should probably ask next, if they have problems, if they encounter pupils showing this type of attributes, how is the pupil reading in BM? That is what we should be asking, and I'm sure a lot of you out there who are watching this have been asking the same question. So kudos to you. Okay, let's hope that you stop using cannot read label though. For the second profile, what teachers may say is that they can read. This pupil, they can read, but very weak. You see where's the weakness in this particular label, can't you? Okay, what actually may be happening inside the head of the pupil or throughout the experience is that they are having some sort of weaknesses in both accuracy or fluencies or both. So now what teachers should ask is decoding automatic and accurate? Can they actually, number one, recognize the phonemes? Number two, can they segment the phonemes? And can they blend it? Blend the phonemes, blend the syllables. So if those three can be carried out with high accuracy, then they should improve as time goes by. And the last profile, pupil, will be described as always forgets simple words. Okay. Again, by labeling simple words, we are not actually being accurate here, because what they are struggling with is not simple words, but rather high frequency words. So those two can be, they should not be used intentionally. Okay. So what actually may be happening is weak high frequency word recognition, and what we should be asking is which word recognition strand is weakest. In this case, is the high frequency words. So we need to provide them with a lot more reading materials that contain those high frequency words in a useful manner. Always, always, always make sure that the materials that we provide to the pupils are useful, not just some random sentences that we put in together with no connection, no relationship with one another, just some non-meaning sentence even just because we want to provide them with practice. We should not do that. So at the end of this particular slide, I hope that we all can come to a realization that the same label, cannot read, can mask very different instructional needs. And all teachers should know this. Not all pupils, every single pupils has different needs from one another. And I know that it's going to be difficult to meet all the needs, but I understand that we can all do that. All right, be patient with me. We're not too far off the end of my presentation. So, how is a good diagnostic pathway looking like? Step 1, how is this particular pupil reading in BM if BM is their mother tongue, or their mother tongue is indeed similar to Bahasa Melayu? So we have to look at their strong points. Then we look at what actually is the problem, or are the problems. What exactly break down in English reading? And then we identify which strand seems to be the weakest. So we move on from the labeling, from the strengths itself. We move from not being able to read or cannot read to specific noticing. And when we do that, we should be able to help our pupils more rather than labeling them as cannot read. Now this is my second last slide. What should change after you have finished watching this particular video? Now, I am not an expert. I realize that some of you, probably most of you, watching this particular webinar have more experience in the field compared to me. But I do hope that you all can take away something from this particular webinar. If nothing, I hope that you can refer to the final slide, this slide. Stop the catch-all. Catch-all here means the blanket, okay? Stop using cannot read as a blanket label. Hopefully, please stop doing that. We can call them struggling readers, but to be more accurate, we should be using the term as emergent bilingual. They are struggling with high frequency words. They are not decoding with high automaticity. Those are the terms that we should be using. And number 2, we don't use one profile. We don't use one label for all. Differentiate the profiles. We notice specific attributes, specific difficulties that our pupils are displaying, and we go with that. We run with that. We don't ignore it, because each one of them requires specific assistance from us. And this usually happens when you just take over a new class. It would not be a bad way for you to actually check both languages. Or if you are in SJKC or SJKT watching this, in however many languages that are being taught in that particular school. Because we have to look at their strong point first. If they, at the strongest point, for example, in their mother tongue, they, even during that time, even in Bahasa Melayu periods, they are still struggling with letter, then we should probably expect the similar thing to happen in English. It could change, but we should probably expect the same thing. But still, we cannot call them as cannot read in Bahasa Melayu. If they are struggling to recognize letters, we can just call them emerging reader. All right, the fourth one is we need to focus on word recognition. So in the word recognition strengths just now, pinpoint where the components, the missing components. If we do that, we should be able to complete this. We should be able to provide them with enough support moving forward. Speaking of support, we should match the particular support that we intend to do with the weaknesses that they have. I hope that we all don't treat it as one shoe fits all kind of thing, because it's not particularly going to be helpful for the pupils. It may be helpful for certain pupils, but in general, none of them will benefit as much from it. We have to align the interventions with the precise nature of the difficulties that the pupils are facing. Last but not least, use precise diagnostic language when we are talking to colleagues, when we are talking to the parents, because we all deserve to know what's really happening with the pupils, and they deserve to know what their weaknesses are, so that perhaps they could take a lot more intervention efforts at home or in other classes and push the pupils forward even more. Because truth be told, fixing this particular issue is not a one-person job. Everyone has to pull together to help the pupils. Okay, for this particular slide, let me end it with this. Precision in identification is the first step towards precision in support. Once we use the right words, then only we can offer the right support. So that is the end of my webinar today. These are all the useful materials that I've been referring to in the making of this. So as you can see here, the first one is decoding reading and reading disability. So this is, despite being old, this is something that I always refer to when we're talking about decoding and also reading, and it's not specifically meant for special education. It's a very good read. And then the second one is an early reading assessment battery for multilingual learners in Malaysia. Sorry about that. This is by local researchers. Assisting struggling early ESL readers. What can English teachers do? This is what I've been working with as well. And last but not least, Scabra in 2001. Connecting early language and literacy to letter reading disabilities. So this is quite influential because we are basing a lot of reading through the Scabra reading rope. That's all from me. I hope that you all have learned something today. And for the future webinar, if you are interested in any sort of remediation or intervention planning, please put them down in the comment. We'll see what we can do. And for the schools in Samarahan, Kuching, Serian areas, if you are interested in our assistance, please reach out to my email in the beginning of the video just now. Once again, thank you very much for joining me, and see you later. Thank you.